Rondo. Here we are talking about the big elephant in the room at our next bonus podcast edition. So today we're going
Absolutely.
to talk a little bit about the aftermath of the U.S. election and this sort of disruptive situation that, the direction of travel being very disruptive. And I'm looking forward to it. My name is Matt Tice.
I'm Rondo Moses. Yeah, Matt. So just a couple of months ago, we were talking about the U.S. 2024 presidential election and looking at it through the lens of insurgent versus incumbents. And we were saying then that the campaigns were taking different approaches to how they were trying to, build voter turnout, get votes, et cetera. And I think we were going back and forth around the Trump Vance campaign being more of, well, at the time I was positioning them as more of coming with their 2016 sort of playbook, saying they're driving change, making America great again, was again the slogan. But what was interesting is that their use of social media and online platforms and podcasts and sort of not really getting too involved with the traditional media really was a disruptive and different approach to politics, different from the Harris Walz campaign that was really still somewhat reliant on traditional media, but I would say in the latter part of the campaign started to move more to some of the podcasts and social media activity, but probably a little too late. So we had an interesting conversation back and forth about the campaigns and how they were approaching both from a messaging point of view and a get out the vote point of view, and even from an audience point of view. I think you made the point that the Trump campaign, unlike the Harris campaign that was really looking at building a broad coalition in a big tent, the Trump campaign really knew who its base was and was really staying focused on that base. And it worked. It worked for them.
It did work, and so here we are. So I think the challenge for us today is to extrapolate that conversation a bit and see whether or not that insurgent playbook has transcended the election and moved into the current phase, which is now, I guess 10 or 12 days into the new administration. I think it'd be interesting to just reflect on that. But to get started, I think is a nice segue. You talked about just a moment ago this whole notion of, the original campaign approach and then a couple of these major differences, but particularly this notion of staying really close to your audience, to your
Mhm.
constituents. And I dug out an old slide just to get a sense of how well aligned it was, the election approach, and more importantly, the current administrative approach to the sort of the playbook of the insurgent. And I thought
Mhm.
it might be interesting to sort of go through these one at a time and use this as a bit of a framework for our discussion today.
Okay.
So I'm going to take you through these, and then we'll maybe go back to them one at a time and have a chat about the current direction of travel in this context. So the first thing we talk about is start with the customer and basically, so that's to have a very demand side focus, but to look for lazy incumbents and unhappy customers. So I think it's
Right.
interesting to see whether or not that plays a role here. The second thing that we talk about is having done that, then is to exploit the weaknesses of the incumbent. So either those that aren't serving those customers or doing something, significantly off piste to maintain the status quo for whatever reason. The third one is look for the convergence of unstoppable trends. So whether that be, emerging capabilities or technology, or to your point, social media,
Mhm.
what is the mix of different variables that's going to drive a reception to change, I think is pretty interesting to think about. While sort of product disruption exists, it's generally the model that gets disrupted. So I think the interesting thing here will be to reflect on, we have a well-established model that's sort of some 250 years old. Is that model now obsolete? And is that model ripe to be challenged? I think there are different views on that. It's interesting.
Yeah.
Next on my list is that every model, every business model, is underpinned by a set of foundational assumptions. And Typically the insurgent will test and challenge those assumptions, turn them over, think about them differently. We'll
Yeah.
see if that plays a role here. Um, and then obviously, as those assumptions get challenged, then the question is, how do you rebuild the business model in a different way? So, is there a different model to create different sources of value? And that is interesting. Number seven is probably only partially relevant here, but I think in terms of, looking for creating a model that sort of finds itself on a different cost curve can be very important. So, to what degree did the old model was unaffordable or not competitive or didn't deliver marginal costs at the appropriate rate, whatever that is. Number eight, sort of look for inspiration outside of your current industry definition, in this case, government sort of
Right.
definition, and ideally from adjacent ecosystems, not necessarily inside your own bubble. Number nine, recast the boundaries of value creation and avoid fortress co sort of thinking in your business. So that's sort of, that's that deep inward looking sort of characteristic of the incumbent that's very typical. And then number 10 is start back at the beginning and go back to the
Go
customer.
back to the customer.
Right. So, I think it's very interesting having reflected on these elements of the playbook. How many fit, Rondo? What do you think? Let's start with
Yeah,
number
I
one. Start
want I
with
want to
the
start with
customer.
that customer because I think the point is that during the campaign, what was really interesting is that, usually in the US, the primary is where, candidates will focus on their base, whether you're Democratic base or your Republican base. And then when you get to the general election, you're trying to broaden the coalition. That's usually the strategy. But what's really
Pivot back to the
interesting, at least
center.
from a campaign perspective, that the Trump Vance campaign still seemed to really stay very closely to the base, even in the general election. But now it's time to govern, right? So it's time to govern. And is that his administration going to be able to govern effectively in a situation where now you really have to govern for all? Now your customer base is large. It's not just the base of people that got, well, typically that's the way it's been. It's not just the base of people that got you elected. So, and he's implementing a lot of executive orders and trying to push things through. And it seems as though some things may be quietly sticking because no one's pushing back, but a lot of the big ones seems to be falling along the wayside or getting challenged either in the courts or through lawmakers or through the public, coming to say, hey, we don't want that, or, we didn't ask for that. So I don't know if, to me, the jury's still out is when you move into that governing phase, how much of the changes to the model, so to speak, are what the broader customers really want now, which is going to be different.
Okay, so I'm going to challenge that, Rondo, because I think I'm going to give the the administration sort of a 9 out of 10 on this one. Okay, and the reason I'm going to do that is that the second part of that sentence, look for lazy incumbents and unhappy customers. Okay, so clearly that group of people that is attracted to the Trump story is has a perception that the incumbent government sort of model is not fit for purpose for them. I'm not sure they've been able to articulate an alternative, but that's certainly a perception.
Hmm.
And the government is big, fat, and lazy and expensive and doesn't deliver value. Now, I think a really important question is who is the customer, and you're assuming that in a government, the customer is the whole population, and I think that assumption has been overturned. That the base is the target customer here, not the whole population, and the government is managing to the base, not the center.
So you are arguing that that base still remains the customer even when you're governing and you ignore the other 60% of people who either didn't vote or voted for the Harris Walz ticket.
I'm
Is that
arguing that that's the direction of travel that I observe in this current situation. I'm not saying
so far in week
that's how
after
it
week
should be.
one?
I'm
After
saying
week one.
traditionally, and I agree completely with you, the
Yeah.
norm has been to fight it out in the primaries, serve your base,
Right.
win the primary, and pivot to the middle.
Right.
Okay. This
Right.
situation is fight it out with your base, right? Win the primary, and then serve your base at the expense, or perhaps maybe not at the expense, but um, with priority to the base over the needs of the whole. And I think there's an interesting conversation to be had here. There's a lot of discussion right now about this unitary theory of the executive, whether or not, and particularly this is a kind of drawing from, if you will, the way corporations are organized as largely autocracies. Okay.
Hmm.
And that sort of concept seems to have been picked up and applied, is being attempted to be applied now into the public context with the government. Okay.
Hmm.
And the US isn't the only, this is a Hungary approach, or we're seeing that in lots of different democracies where this is sort of coming up. So, but anyway, coming back to this,
But that would be a change to the
it
U.S.
would
business model,
it
right?
would be a change, and we can come back to it. But I think it's interesting because the unhappy customers seem to gravitate towards that idea. The government can't get anything done. It's big fat, it's lazy. The executive needs more power to get things done more quickly or more deliberately, whatever the terminology is. But I just like to reflect very briefly that there is a significant difference between a corporation and a country, or two, in my mind. One we've already discussed, which is a corporation chooses its segments that it's going to serve and deliberately ignores other segments. So in a sense,
Absolutely.
it decides who we're going to create value for, and the customer has a vote whether they want to engage with that corporation or not most of the time. Okay, so I'm not saying that's always the case, but if I want to buy Coke or Pepsi, I can make that decision at the shelf of the supermarket, right?
Right.
So the second thing is that the employee of a corporation also has a choice whether or not they want to work there or
Right.
not. In a country, both of those things are not true because everyone is at the shopping, everyone's in the shopping center and everyone has to buy the product, whether they like it or not. And they have to pay for that product, whether they like it or not, through taxes and other things, right?
Correct.
So that's one. And then second, there's no real opting out. You can't say, I don't want to be an employee. I mean, of course, you could not be an employee of the public service or the government, but I think as a citizen, you know, as an analogy, you are an employee at some level. You're an employee generating tax revenue. So from that point of view, you can't opt out of that either. So it's interesting to think whether that unitary theory is appropriate.
But I
Anyway, I
would
don't want
think
to talk too
I
much
would
about it.
push back because I think in at least in the US, our model is that, our purpose of government is for the people by the people, right? The government is there to serve the interests of its population of people. And it's not the population or traditionally, it's not just been the population of some. The governing philosophy has been it's the population of all. So really, it's messy because there are a lot of different interests, that have to be satisfied in the U.S. and sometimes competing interests. So it makes it very challenging and messy. But nonetheless, that's the focus of government in contrast to a corporation. To your point, there's really, you're an employee to some extent at will. Um, you understand the parameters of what is required for you to be successful inside that corporation. And you make a choice whether you are going to want to work there or somewhere else. Now, some people would say, you can similarly say, hey, I don't like the requirements of being an American, and so I want to go and be a Canadian or a Mexican, or I want to go to Australia. You know what I mean? So it really, some could look at it that way too. But
Those choices are valuable to relatively few, let's be honest.
right,
But again, I'm not judging here. I'm just saying what I'm observing is
yeah,
that these norms that you just described, the government of the people for the people, the definition of people seems to have been significantly narrowed here. That's all I'm saying.
right. And by doing that, at least in the US, does that mean, and this is why I think some people are arguing we're actually going backwards, because there was a time when the government of the US was for some people and not other people. Everybody wasn't served by the decisions, or at least being served fairly by the decisions that were being made by government. So I think that to some extent, that point of view is a point of view that some people will say is what could pull us back to sort of some of the US's not so good times, right?
That's possible. We'll see. But let's stay theoretical here in terms of our just objective review of the current direction of travel against this playbook. But it's another good pivot that you raised because the tradition and history of the current model by the people for the people, it said the Constitution, all of the norms around the Constitution, good behavior in politics, or at least relatively good behavior in politics, all these things.
Hmm.
Number two on my list, exploit the weaknesses of the current system. Okay, so
Yep.
might be helpful to sort of unpack some of those weaknesses. I'll just start with one that comes to mind is the some of these norms are very traditional in a sense that they're not codified by law. For example, the Merrick Garland decision during the Obama presidency set the table for a very skewed Supreme Court, for example,
Yeah.
which was largely tradition and not law. But that assumption or that weakness was exploited, and obviously that's created a significant difference. I think we could go through a pretty long list of where those incumbent weaknesses have left open opportunities for exploitation.
Yeah, I mean, the reality is it was based on a trust, right? So a lot of it was based on America, the democracy and idea was based on trust. And so there were, to your point, not specific regulations in place for every aspect. It was just that this is the norm and people tend to adhere to those norms. But when you have a disruptive force that comes in, the risk is they choose to ignore the norm, and that's how you can get change. But I do believe that it was because one of the foundations of the model was a trust, in the partners in the model.
I agree with that. And I think also is, you have, and this is very typical of competitive disruption, where you have a very clear insurgent incumbent. Okay. And in this
Mhm.
case, we have a Republican insurgent. I guess we can kind of agree that's where we're at, and a Democratic incumbent, or a Democratic system that is, and I don't mean red, blue here. I certainly
Exactly.
mean red in terms of Republicans challenging, but I think the system isn't red or blue. The system is the system. The system
Right.
is defined by the Constitution. That's the incumbent. Now, the weakness of that system is in part, I think, as we've already described, trust, tradition plays a big role in that. I think
Hmm.
speed plays a big role in it too. The system is not designed to adapt to the change that we're experiencing in the economy, in trade, in immigration, in technology. It's things are changing very quickly, and that system is is designed to be very slow and deliberative
Deliberative.
in order to your point earlier, in order to create a balance between the needs of the many and the needs of the few. So I think it's
Mhm.
interesting to see that, in my opinion, one of the biggest weaknesses is that the system has been extremely resilient for a very long period of time until now. The conditions that surround it put it in a very fragile situation. So a group of individuals willing to test those trust and those norms. That's one. Particularly a population that is informed in very different ways through social media and kind of the decline of traditional media, the rise of autocracy in other parts of the world, or at least one party rule. And there's a whole bunch of
Yeah.
different forces that are sort of coming together that then expose these very significant weaknesses in the system.
Well, to your point, I think that the challenge with the system for most people has been that it does not change fast enough. There's no People don't see the change, and usually when you have a campaign, one candidate is the candidate of, is the incumbent. The other candidate is running on some sort of change agenda or perceived change agenda. The reality has been in the past that even that change candidate has not made changes fast enough for some people. So over time, people just got, I would say, very discouraged with the system because they feel that it doesn't change, and some people feel left out. For example, I would say young people feel like this system is left them, right? That the baby boomers like me and others have taken advantage of the system, and there's nothing for them. So it's just that this system has not evolved fast enough, to your point, for where the people are, the needs of the people. It has not evolved fast enough to address not just technology, but just the needs of the people, because
Hmm.
conditions have changed so rapidly over the past couple of decades, but the systems really have not. And I
Well,
think
that's
that,
a good segue to our next point, which is this convergence of unstoppable trends, Rondo. What are they? Like, what are these things that are happening that sort of set this up for, kind of wholesale challenge to the system?
Mhm. Well, I think some people would say that a big shock to the system was globalization.
Hmm.
Globalization and the outsourcing of jobs to from the U.S., which created job deserts in some states and in some areas of the U.S. I think it created a lot of anxiety amongst the electorate, and that's really pushed people to say we need. That's really was really driving, I think, the force for change. The change in terms of how do I create new opportunities for people who have been displaced. I think that's been something that has been building for decades, actually.
Okay.
I think
Yep.
that's a big one, and I do think technology has been played a part of that too, in terms of displacing people from work. But a big that globalization, I think people at least 10 years ago would have said that that's the big nut that's really driving away a lot of American jobs.
Hmm. You know, I suppose you can't ignore the immigration question, whether or not that globalization is coming into the country in a sense that those jobs are being displaced there as well. Um,
But
but
what's interesting, I think, is that because the globalization pulled jobs, and so you have people maybe who are without jobs, they see immigrants coming in, and although the immigrants were probably taking the low-level jobs, they were looking at it and saying they're employed and I'm not. You know what I mean? So I think it was creating a lot more animosity towards immigrants because people were having a more challenging time finding employment. If they were able to find a job a little easier, immigration would probably not be as hot an issue, I think,
Hmm.
as it is right now.
It'd be interesting to reflect, and we don't really have time here to talk about it, but on that creative destruction of these jobs has sort of always been the case, right? It happened when steam gave way to electricity, for example. It happened again
Yes.
when, in the post-war period. It happened again, with the internet in the early 2000s, and it's happening again now with AI and globalization, as you point out. So, these forces always exist, but I think again, what's different here is that people are mobilized at scale to push back on them. And I think also what's interesting is that there is and we'll come back to this a little bit more, but people are now more comfortable with disruption because they see it everywhere else. You know what I mean?
Mm.
Like we talked before about NVIDIA disrupting Intel, and uh, we talked about the challenges that Boeing has faced and so forth. So, it's sort of we're seeing this everywhere now. So I guess
Mhm.
it's easy to agree that there's a very ripe sort of very ripe set of conditions that make this possible. And I guess the pivot here, the most interesting question is then, given all that change, given a motivated customer or constituency, given a weak system or a system that's now weak because of these sets of conditions, where is the business model, the traditional American constitutional system, and equally tied to that, this sort of global order, which relates America to the rest of the world, and in many ways, the rest of the world to each other. Where is that being challenged in this current environment?
Wow, I think that's a big question. That's a big question. I think it's being challenged on a lot of different fronts. I mean, just think about America's role in the world. Part of this new administration is to rethink that or reimagine that. Just the pulling out of who, for example, the pushback or the insistence that our allies have to do more, pay their fair share. Like that kind of thinking is non-traditional for America, so it's different. And I think it sort of says that America, the focus should be on, and I've heard this before, America first, as opposed to, we have America is there to support our global allies, and we recognize that we may have to carry a heavier load than others, but that's our position in the world, and that we need to manage that. So I do think that that's an aspect that is really going to be ripe for change, and it's really happening. Um, I also think that, when we look at America's technology capabilities, I know the previous administration was really trying to do a lot to build, America as the source of advantage from, the chips manufacturing perspective. And, ideally that would have translated into AI as well. But we don't know now that, DeepSeek has, landed, whether, that's still an opportunity for us. But I think that that is something that this new administration, with its $500 billion investment in AI, is seeking, is that, we have to dominate on the technology front as a nation. Whether that will happen, I don't know, but I think that that's an agenda that this new administration is going to be, and that's coming from outside money, private money, not necessarily government funding to make that happen. So I do think that there are a number of changes that this new administration will really push hard on in terms of the business model for the U.S. I mean, getting that much involvement from the private sector, more so than I would say traditionally, is a big deal. When you have the setup of the Doge operation with Elon Musk, billionaire Elon Musk leading that, that's a different way where people in America are saying we actually have Elon Musk as the president and Donald Trump is working for him. So you have a different change, I think, in terms of the distance between government and business. That distance is narrowing. It's closed, actually. And so it's a blending based on what this new administration is doing, I think.
Well, you could make an argument that this playbook that we're talking through is the tech disruption playbook being applied to the U.S. government. But I think it's fair to say that the business model of the United States is the Constitution, right? It's there, it's written, it's been evolved over a period of a couple of centuries now. And I made a list. I agree with you. Everything from, the big elephant in the room is immigration, how we treat people in the country. Give me you're tired, you're poor. That's no longer a tradition. We're flipping that on its head. I think the constitutional challenges are really interesting. In particular, there are a couple of big ones. Obviously, one with birthright citizenship,
Birthright citizenship.
and
Yeah.
even coming down to the TikTok decision. That's a question of that's been approved by the lawmakers and reaffirmed by
Supreme
the
Court.
Supreme Court. So this question of our constitutional system has set the table for certain decisions. To what degree does the executive need to toe the line on that's being challenged. With trade, I think we've talked about that already a little bit. Certainly that, to your earlier point, the big shift in terms of the model of a multilateral system being the source of safety. That's basically the network of allies and economic relationships that surround the Western world, at least. Changing that to a model now of unipolar or bilateral sort of transactional I win, you lose relationships is,
Hmm.
is a
Hmm.
very significant change to the model, right?
Hmm.
And I think the question there will be, is that a safer model for the collective than the previous model that was
I think I see it as like the elevation of the national over the global perspective.
hmm. But again, it's looking at it from a model point of view, that's just a huge shift,
That's a huge
right?
shift. Absolutely. Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
and then I think, to your point about Doge, this idea that an external organization can look into the system and drive that change. Now, of course, as management consultants, we're probably, sort of we understand that model, that a fresh perspective could be required. But,
Right.
in some ways, it's an unconstitutional authority. So that is also being challenged. So it's almost literally across the board, all of these changes are, significantly challenging the model. They talk about in tech, move fast and break things. Well, clearly, this is almost like a blitzkrieg of change, right? And I feel like the traditional opposition is standing at the beach in Dunkirk, and the choice is either to fight it or to keep your powder dry and fight it another day. I don't know how
Right.
it'll play out, but certainly the model is under. I don't even want to say threat because I don't think that's fair. I think the model is being assaulted in a way that has not yet revealed itself to us in
Mhm.
terms of what the alternative will shape towards.
I also think that, when we were talking about Doge, I also think the model is shifting in that traditionally the power and influence has been in the hands of the people and the masses. But I think given the direction, the power is shifting to a smaller subset of people, the oligarchs, for example. So I
Hmm.
do believe that in this model, when you look at where the power is going, who's going to be making the decision, these are people who have a lot of money. Yeah, they have one vote, just like we all do, but they have a lot of money, so they have a lot more power and influence. I mean, just the fact that, Elon Musk is running Doge, he's got a lot of other interests tied up, business interests tied up, but this is the person that is really has the ear of the president of the United States and can really influence decisions that are being made. So I think that that's a big shift as well. Whether that is going to be a long-term trend, I don't know, but certainly with this administration, for how long it lasts, that's a big shift in terms of
Sure.
democracy.
So I think it's fair to say if we move on to the next one, virtually every assumption about how government is run and how the Constitution works, those assumptions are being challenged or overturned at a very high rate.
Yeah,
We made examples of that. So, and your point about the power shifting is, I think, really interesting. Like, who is it for? I think is interesting, right? So, is it for the people or is it for the powerful? I think that's, it might be naive to suggest that it hasn't always been that way at some level, but clearly it's much more nakedly obvious now that that shift is
right,
happening,
right,
which is new. So, and then I think, Doge itself suggests that there's a deep dissatisfaction with the the cost curve of the government. The theory is that it's too expensive, it's too bloated, it's overwrought, and consequently needs to be gutted.
right,
So now, as an efficiency expert, I have some um, understanding that certainly a more efficient system, whether that be a corporation or a government, makes sense. It's really a question of what are the trade-offs, in my opinion.
right. And also when you look at, the purpose or the role of government as opposed to the role of business, right? So a business is about as the shareholders and profit, although, of course, customers are important, but for-profit businesses are there to make money and they are evolving their purpose to make sure to, I think, expand it to include more thinking around how do we support our society and community, et cetera. But ultimately, they're there and they're making money for shareholders. When you look at government, as we said, it's for the people. And so the role of the outcomes that you're trying to achieve are different. So does that mean that how you achieve those outcomes should be looked at differently as well? I think that that's important too.
Rondo, I got to challenge you there. Whilst I agree with the sentiment, I think that is an assumption that is being challenged, right?
Oh, I know it's being challenged.
So to me, that's like the core assumption. Who is the government for? Is it for the people or for the powerful? I think that's a question that's being playing out in front of our eyes, right?
Right.
And, is so to your also to your point, if the government's being run more like a corporation, back to my earlier point about the unitary executive theory, is the government a vehicle for the executive to make money? I don't know, but we haven't talked about the Trump coin and the Melania coin, but for example, that would have been unthinkable in any other era of politics in the United States, right? So,
Well,
aside
but
from
that's only because there were norms that
correct.
people adhered to and they followed, regardless of them, being baked in. There were norms and they did that. But a disruptor can ignore those norms, right?
All right, Rhonda, why don't we take a short break and we'll come back and we'll talk a little bit more about some of the latter part of my list and see if we can't kind of come to a conclusion.
Sounds great.
Okay, bringing back our kind of really interesting conversation here, Rondo. I think it's interesting maybe to explore just for a minute these analogs. So we've kind of touched on it a little bit. Like,
Hmm. Hmm.
where do you think this current challenger is drawing inspiration from? Is that largely from inside, from outside? What's the pattern that they're trying to follow here?
I think the administration is drawing the inspiration from, I think, one from the base. I think from the base of people who are looking to them for leadership. I think they're drawing inspiration from them. But I also think that they're drawing inspiration from other powerful leaders. So they're looking at other leaders around the world, from past leaders who they may have admired, and they're trying to emulate or model their leadership style and their way of driving change. You know,
Hmm,
that's where I think their inspiration is coming from.
I agree. I think it's a smash up of the time-tested historical playbook for undermining a constitutional democracy.
Yeah,
Um, That's A, and we can see, which generally sort of means transition from either a multi or a dual party system to a single party system, right? So we don't need to go through the list, but China has that model, Russia has that model,
Russia, exactly.
Hungary has that
Hungary,
model. We could go historically back to Italy or Germany or Argentina or Venezuela. There's the list is very long. Okay,
right.
so that I think the smash up between that playbook and the tech playbook,
Yeah,
which is the move fast and break things playbook, which is to challenge everything, test every boundary. When things break, fix them in a new way, or when things, if they don't work, don't do them and discard them. But whatever you do, move really quickly. So I think it's sort of what I'm seeing is these two things coming together, and the conditions are really underwritten, if you will, by a super motivated, very discrete base segment that's basically underwriting this approach.
yeah. I think the business leaders the are bringing that latter perspective to the table. I think that the Trump Vance traditional
Sure, it's the
administration,
Peter Thiel, it's the Elon Musk,
Elon
etc.
Musk,
If you sat
absolutely
down with Elon Musk and said, "What's the playbook?" He'd say,
right,
"Well, here's how I do it. I put the rocket up, I blow it up, I see what happens, and then I try again, and
right.
make moderate adjustment to that. And essentially, why don't you apply that model here? That makes a lot of sense."
And I'm sure you've heard, so from that efficiency point of view, cost cutting point of view, that they just announced a volunteer retirement, not retirement, resignation program because, and you have to agree to it by February 6th. But this is a way of sort of picking off people who really want to get out of government and offering them 7 months of pay. Like they would be paid until September of this year, but they have to agree to resign.
Yeah, it'd be
Now.
interesting to see if they actually get paid. But again, Elon,
But that
how
could be
did
a lot
you
of
do that
people.
at Twitter, right? How did you take away 80% of the operating costs of Twitter? Well, I fired everybody and consequences be damned. And it turned out we didn't need all those people. So it's sort of, again, this playbook is, you can see it
Well,
translating into
and it's not just people that
ultimate
get fired,
consequences.
people will leave, right? Because
Right.
they're afraid of what might happen,
That's
they're
functionally
confused.
equivalent, really, right?
Right. They
Virtually the
just
same
walk
thing.
away.
But it's a different model, right?
Yeah.
So whether or not we agree with it or it's appropriate is irrelevant. The point is that that is the insurgent playbook. Do I need all these resources to to create this level of output? The question needs to be answered and tested, and that is, I think, the mindset here, which is let's deal with the short-term pain to find out the answer in a rather ham-fisted, quasi-scientific way. Do I need all these people to deliver this outcome or not? And
Hmm.
I'm not sure, but there at least seems to be a reason and a pattern why this is happening.
Hmm.
Um,
Well, somebody could say that it's more of a private equity model, right? So you
mm,
go in and you're trying to figure out how do I make this company better so that I can sell it for much more value on the other side. And a lot of times that often it involves taking a lot of cost out of the business, which means letting go a lot of people, right?
sure.
You don't, so it could be, insurgents model, insurgent behavior, disruptive behavior is not necessarily synonymous with mass layoffs, right? We don't want to communicate that. It's
No.
thinking differently, right? It's operating differently.
How
You know,
would I do this on a different cost curve? I think
right.
is the question, right? Now,
Yeah.
there's lots of different ways to do that. That is one lever. Now, in our firm, we're much more demand side guys than supply side guys. We like to seek growth rather than cut. You know what I mean?
Right.
So it's
Right.
certainly our philosophy is much more about find new ways to compete and innovate competition so that you can grow rather than look deep inside to tear out costs. That's certainly not our philosophy. But at the same time, at a level of looking at the options, I think there is some logic to why you might pursue that. And I think your private equity model point is a really good one, is sort of and I think one of the things we talked about in the prep for this was the question of whether or not creating a valuable new endpoint is the goal. In this case, as we've probably argued, that goal is to serve the base, not the whole population for
Hmm.
whatever reason, but that's fine. That's a choice, and not going to judge that choice here. But the question, I think we would strongly argue that the insurgent mindset does not exist to destroy or deconstruct for its own sake.
Right.
Okay, so the goal of the insurgent or the insurgent mindset is to seek a new equilibrium that creates more value for
Creates more value.
stakeholders, customers, et cetera. Do that often with a different model that has more favorable characteristics to the different parties that are there, and in a company sense, puts a company on a more sustainable competitive footing, right? So
Yes.
that's the overarching typical goal of the insurgent, not to break and destroy for its own sake, but rather find a new territory for value creation that meets the market in many ways.
Yeah, because we often hear the term disrupt yourself before you get disrupted, right? But that doesn't mean, to your point, that doesn't mean tearing it down. It means figuring out where are the opportunities to do things differently, do them better, to improve your competitive position and create more value. Where are the opportunities in your business model to do that?
And again, I think the theory of this government is exactly that, whether we agree or not, is that, for example, by challenging trade relationships with tariffs, we'll get a better deal, as in the US government or the US Treasury, whatever, we'll get a better deal from that. Now, you may not agree with it, but what they're solving for is America first. So I want to fill the Treasury at the expense of my allies. Whereas more historically, it's been let's find a balance where the Treasury, well, as long as we're number one, we're the most competitive, that's fine. But our influence is largely driven by connecting the world to our model for multipolar relationships. Now that has changed, so it's
Hmm.
yet to be seen whether or not that new model will serve the long-term interests of, the Treasury, the population. Certainly, it serves the short-term perceived interests of the base.
Right.
We'll see.
Right.
But this is across the board. These are the kinds of changes that are being made.
Yeah. And the reality is we are 1 week into a 4 year, administration. And so we don't know what the future holds, how much will actually stick, how much change will actually happen. Like I said, we've had a lot of executive orders that have been put out, ideas thrown out. But let's see what actually sticks and what change really actually takes hold because it's, again, what it feels like now is a lot of activity, a lot of questions, and people are some concerned, people some very happy. But what ultimately will stick, I think time will tell, and we don't know that yet.
And that's partly because we don't know what the endpoint looks like, right? So that
Right,
hasn't revealed
right,
to us yet. So we don't know. So it's more typical of the insurgent to have clarity around what their vision for the future might look like and be able to articulate that, right? Largely
right,
because in competition, that's how you get funds, that's how you get capital to do the things that you want to do. You have to clarify that vision. In
right.
this case, the capital exists, but the vision is not clear yet.
Yeah.
So I agree with you. I think it's,
But
we're
some
just,
will say that Project 2025 is the vision. My question is, well, let's see how much of that actually gets done. How much of that can
sure.
they actually implement,
And I think what we always see is that eventually, or maybe not eventually or immediately, the system will always fight back, right?
Right,
Okay,
right,
so the incumbent system will resist that change, whatever it is.
right,
How many companies have we worked with where you've got to make a big change? The existing system resists that change, even though
right,
the change is either inevitable or fatal if you don't make the change, it will
right.
still resist, right? So the system will resist, and the
Excuse me.
competition gets a vote too. So the competition will always resist the change. They'll either adapt,
Yeah,
and take on board some of the change. To your point, disrupt yourself, or I don't know. Again, how many organizations we worked with that have made wholesale changes to their existing model to be to maintain competitiveness over a period of time. Boeing's not out of business. GM just delivered record profits. These companies are sticky and they
yeah,
will adapt. However, I think that the silver lining here could be, and I hope it is, that these challenges shore up the things that work. In other words, where the system fights back, those institutions get stronger
yeah,
for being tested and challenged. And the things that don't work evolve to a new equilibrium of change that is more appropriate for everyone. And the
yeah,
things that get very terribly broken and created, the carnage, whatever it is, we learn from those things. That's what
yeah,
insurgents do, is to say, oh, geez, that didn't really work. Now, how do we pick up the learning and apply it better next time? So
yeah,
my optimistic view would be that if we're in a mindset where these changes can potentially be um, vectored in a direction that's positive, that would be helpful.
that would be helpful. That would be
That would.
helpful. Yeah, awesome.
Okay, well, big topic, Rondo. I
I
think that gets us
know.
to our 10, right? I think our advice would
Always
then be,
great.
our advice, I think, for the opposition here would be to return to number one. What is your base and what is the whole customer, what does the whole population need? And be really clear on that.
Yeah,
I guess our advice to the challenger would be to to seek to clarify what is the vision that we're aiming towards, and how are we going to learn from that, and where can we take from the good, and apply that forward, and and make adjustments along the way that are meaningfully supportive to the whole rather than the parts.
absolutely. Absolutely. Awesome. Great
Very good,
conversation.
Rondo. Well, it's been fun. I'm sure we'll get a lot of chatter on this one, and I'll look forward to our next go around.
Absolutely. Likewise.
All right, great to see you, and have a good weekend.
Cheers, Matt.